Hi, my name is Vince, and today I'm going to teach you how to paint eyes. What? Hello and welcome. Today we're going to work on the eye. And if there's one thing I like to focus on my channel, it's that we learn to paint what we see and not necessarily have an equation or a certain amount of measurements that make up the eye from one vantage point that ultimately makes a really cool drawing, or you end up getting something that looks like a realistic eye, but then you have no way of taking that information and then painting the eye from other angles. So to start off, I just wanted to get this cast here of the eye. This is supposedly Michelangelo's David, and I just like to look at this three-dimensionally for a moment to think about the structure of the eye. We have obviously the eyeball, which we know is much larger back there in the head, which is covered by the eyelids. You know, we have a few points that meet, but we have an edge here that goes around here that meets this part of the face that comes out. We have the brow ridge where the eye sets up underneath, and this whole big part of flesh and eyebrow that comes out. And I think it's just really good to consider those varying shapes and volumes before we even begin. We may want to do a painting from the vantage point where we're seeing from below. And that's an eye equation sort of tutorial video is not going to help you there. But if you have knowledge of the anatomy and structures around the eye, then you're going to be much better off. Because if we're looking from this side, and we may only see part of the eye, or we may only see this much. But again, if we know these shapes and how they sit and how the eye sits in, how we have the eyelids, and the bridge that then it goes into the nose, and just seeing the way those sit, fall, work in space is just so valuable. If you don't have one of these sets, I recommend you pick it up just to study the overall structure so that when you encounter a different angle, you're not thrown off. So I love these. Pick one up. We'll put a link somewhere. All right, so before we begin really painting, again, we've got to think about this. This is what we're working on. We may be working from a two-dimensional subject, like a photograph, but we got to think about things in terms of three-dimensional shape. All right, let's get to painting. I always love starting off with a little bit of a drawing, a little bit of a line drawing to just help guide me when I'm laying down paint. And so I'll look at the subject, and I'm just gonna lay in something that's two-dimensional. It's gonna feel really flat compared to what I just talked about in the cast, but I'm just keeping all of those shapes in mind that we're going to get to. So we got to start somewhere. I always like starting just kind of in the tear duct in the little corner. Just my favorite spot. I don't know. Is it right or is it wrong? Probably, maybe. But that's just how I do it. And that's the great thing about art is there's a lot of ways just to jump in and get started. I like to just set up a little bit of a point that I'm gonna go to on the other side too. So I might say, no, let's see the eye, we'll make it about that wide. What I'm gonna look at very clearly is what shape I see the eyelid taking on. So I just take a moment to glance at the subject and see how it's gonna work. Even though I'm thinking of it in two dimensions here, I'm thinking about how it's going to interact with light, like three dimensions do. So let's see. I see an angle about like this coming off of the eye, starting off. And then it reaches a point about like this and comes around to something. This has a really fancy name. I tried to look it up, but I probably wouldn't pronounce it right, and you'd all make fun of me, so I just decided not to. The corner of the eye, that's what we'll call it. And then I look again at the angle off of the center here and say, okay, this comes out pretty straight, but then we have a little bit of drop. And as we do that, we're bearing in mind, we know the volume of the shape that is under the eyelid. We're thinking anatomically. So we've got a good shape. All we had to do was think of kind of 2 points and watch how these arcs acted within it. Really, really simple. All right, we know we've got the opening. So now we got to think about the eyelid that sits on top of the eyeball. And that also stops underneath the brow ridge. So that's another line we can really look for. And in the subject here, hers starts about right here. It's about this amount of distance from the tear duct. And it comes up at a higher angle. See, that's something I can do immediately in this comparative method. I can look at, okay, here's the angle of the eye opening, but then where her lid touches the top of the brow, the angle is more like this. And these are the type of comparisons, when you make them, you can paint the eye from any angle you want. You don't have to paint it from directly on. And I'm judging a distance here. At what point does the eyelid stop and the brow ridge begin to come back out? And the distance appears to be about this far. And similarly, if I follow this line, if I'm just thinking about this line alone, how far does it go? About to here. Again, we know this is an eyelid. An eyeball is inside of it. So there is another line that kind of comes off that describes the bottom of this lid. It's more around the eyeball around here, but then we still see a little bit of a valley this deep. So I'm going to leave that there. All right, paying attention. Sometimes I'll just kind of quickly look and say, oh, that's a little more angular than it is in real life. So I'm going to adjust that really quick. Now she has some mascara on here, and this line is a little thicker. So I'm going to come in just a little bit to take care of some of the eyelashes that we may or may not include. What? Don't include eyelashes? Yeah, you'll see. Again, focusing, we've got to think very critically about where the iris sits in the opening. Because directionally, it's going to say a lot. So I like to, if we drew our little tear duct here, if we look at the pink membrane, it goes about this far here. And we're just going to keep that in mind. And if that's the case, the iris starts at a distance at about this far. It comes down to the very bottom of the opening. All right, we're paying attention to the iris. We see its entirety all the way down to her bottom eyelid. And pay attention to those things. Those are all important. Because we may paint her with maybe her eyelid is a little higher. And if that were the case, or her eyes are a little more closed, these are all things that you might encounter when you're working from life, or if you had a certain concept for a painting. So don't just learn an equation. Learn to carefully measure and insert the information where it sits. All right, see, all I've done is take a look here to here and judge that distance, and it's maybe even just a little bigger. Same on this side too. I can even notice whether or not the iris begins to turn in. Does it begin to turn in or does it stop? And her eyes are just a little more closed than I made them. I think we're still going to be just fine, but I may lower that just slightly. Can, if we want, do the iris. We'll include that as well. We've got an eye. That's great. Let's go ahead and give a brow ridge and an eyebrow in here too, because I think that'll help us think about the structure that we have over here. So right here, this distance, this is the top where that eyelid meets the top. Then we've got an eyebrow that starts about right here. So this is the place that I think is about the closest to the eyelid, top, when I look at the eyebrow. And then I'm just going to pay attention, where is that point? And if I look down, it falls right across where the iris and the rest of the eye meet right here. And that's all I'm ever doing is comparing this to this. Where does this fall? How close is this? Okay, great. And then we can begin shaping the eyebrow. How far does the eyebrow go? Does it go beyond the tear duct here? Yes, in this case, it does. But that's with this particular model. Someone else is going to be different. And if you're painting a portrait, you've got to pay attention to those little cues. Where do things start and end? So that you can really capture a likeness. All right, I think we've got a good enough start, and we can begin laying in some of the color. First, I like to mix a black. That's how I start every time. And my black is a mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. You can find so many more varying mixtures out there on the internet. This is the one that just happens to work for me. I like it because it gives you the ability to lean it toward the blue or lean it toward burnt sienna. And that's a kind of a warmer or a cooler way to create a black. So we'll get some black ready. And I don't normally like to start off with this small of a brush, but I'm going to go ahead and do so at this time, just so I can look for the darkest darks. That's what I'm achieving first, because I want to compare all the rest of my values to the darkest dark. And here we go. All right, the iris, obviously one of the darkest points, as well as her eyeliner and her eyelashes here, which all just kind of run together. So we're looking for the darkest darks first, and we begin with the pupil and our eyelashes here, our eyeliner. I'm not looking to describe every single eyelash, because that's just not what I see when I look at it. Sure, I see some lines. That's not going to really do you any good. It's going to make that is like unnecessary information. Don't worry about it at the moment. Right now, we want to capture our main values, the darkest points, so that when we move forward, we do so with success. All right, am I moving from this darkest point to the next? I see, we do have some dark areas here in the eyebrow. It's not quite as dark as I've just laid down, but that'll do. And then it's kind of it's a warmer dark, but where the eyelid meets the brow ridge here, it's pretty dark. So I'm constantly making subtle drawing adjustments as I go here. If I look at my source material, I look back at what I'm working on, and I say, well, that needs to come down just a bit. And I go ahead and make those. I won't always necessarily mention it, but that is going on, and you can do that too. Next darkest part is probably going to be the green of her eye. And just because I'm getting some green, don't let that think, oh, it's green, therefore I should get the green. That's not always the answer. But you can mix some really great colors that are a little more appropriate to what you're seeing. The iris is interesting. The iris is a little concave, and so when light is coming from this side, and we can tell the light's coming from that side by the glint in her eye, then we're going to know that some of the lightest area is actually going to be down here, and it'll get darker as it goes around toward the reflection point, the little light glint, which is always the most satisfying thing to put down. So I like to save it for last. I'm one of those people. It was a great start. We've got some nice dark values in, and we just continue to work our way there. I'm going to get a little bit bigger brush as I go. Because we're going to start laying in some of these skin tones here. And, making skin tones around the eye, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. You just can't get too... It's generally a lot lower in chroma, so it's not as saturated as you might think. So what I'll do is I'll just focus on one part. In this case, I'm looking right here, kind of this angle, and I'm looking at my source and I'm asking, okay, what do I see? What is it doing? And what does it look like? And I'm just mixing a little pile until I feel like, all right, that's near there. And it may not quite be right. But it's hard to tell this early on. So I've got to make the best decision I can. This definitely feels more right for the top of the eyelid. Again, thinking about our light source, we know it's coming from the upper right. We know, again, volume-wise, the eye is a sphere. Light is coming from here, striking, these areas that we're going to have our lightest points here on the eyelid. A lot of times you'll find the eyelid takes on some kind of purpley and sometimes green, almost yellowy color. I presume because of how blood flows through it. I don't know, not a doctor, not a scientist, but it definitely looks different. The color is usually a little more dead looking than the rest of the skin, where there's a lot of blood running through on the inner layers and then showing through some semi-transparent skin. Things get a little cooler and greener in areas just outside of the eye right here. You know, when you pay close attention, just next time ask someone next to you, hey, can I stare into your eyes for a second and watch how some of these colors and things happen. They're really nice. And again, that's not something you're gonna learn in a how-to that teaches you to paint or draw an eye. It's just not gonna benefit you at all. Whereas if you're really learning what the eye does, the subtle flesh tones around it, you're gonna come away with a much more satisfying eye the next time you paint it. It's green, it's yellowy right above here. And what I'm doing is I'm just building. There's anytime you're working with the face, any facial feature, you've got a lot to put in. And all of that, all of it matters, but there's just so many little planes of the face around the eye alone, you know, to look at the cast that we had been working on and talking about. So much is going on. It's just, you want to really pay attention. And truly the challenge isn't painting one eye, that's easy. The challenge is painting two eyes. So if you want to really see what you got, try doing two. And then get ready to be horrified. Because that's really the tough part, is matching up what's going on there. Because if one pupil is a little larger than the other, that looks strange. If same for an iris, or millimeters will change what an eyes look like, whether they're looking in the same direction or not. Yeah, it's very difficult. One is relatively easy, so we're doing the easy thing today. Probably will put in a couple highlights here just so I can gauge where I'm at value-wise. And I'll break my rule. Go ahead and get a glint in here, which immediately gives life to it. That's why oftentimes I like to wait, but I want to make sure we're getting somewhere here, and that I'm making good color decisions. You'll notice on my palette, I'm kind of using the same pile, and I might draw a little color in, but when I realize, I need it to be a little warmer, I'm like, I already have some here, and I'll use that. The idea is to keep me from, reaching in and just taking some cad red or some of these colors almost at will, and putting them on, and it just being way too much chroma and too saturated for life. And when that happens, those are the times where it just feels natural, and we can feel down pretty quick. It's hard. Skin tones are they're one of the hardest things to paint. And so when you encounter that, just know that this is something that I've been painting for 20 years, and I am constantly realizing where I missed the mark, and the things that I used to, the kind of quote unquote rules I had, don't really apply anymore in some cases, and how I thought it worked was really wrong. So just know that it's a long road with skin tone, and the only way through that is to paint until you start to get it. Okay, and when I do these, sometimes I bounce around, and I'll change my mind. I'll move from one section to the other, get really distracted. That's just me. So if suddenly you're like, why did he go to that area suddenly? Because I just happen to be looking and saying, I want to address that. So I'm sorry that happens. But the idea is just making my way toward, to greater and greater extent, toward getting something on everything. We want to make sure we're nice and covered before we start to think about some of the smaller details. Notice I'm just using the same brush. That's really helping me keep my chroma down. And also value. I'm not gonna get really, really, really dark or light. This way. So if you're to this point and you're thinking, I just don't see things, they don't seem to be working, I'm gonna check out, I'm gonna go to another channel, where I can just learn to do this in like 5 easy steps, then you're really missing out, and you should stick around for these next moments, because we're really going to get there, and truly this is going to help you paint the eye from any vantage point you want, as soon as you learn how. Okay. One thing about the whites of the eye, they're not white. And if you put down white, they're gonna look so light that it doesn't work. This gray that I've placed in here, value-wise, is pretty accurate. It's darker on top, and I'll adjust that. But so little of the eye you'll actually see as white or even light. It's much more in the dark than we think. So subtlety here is so important. Don't paint the white of the eye white. it never is. Maybe at the very point that it has a reflection from your light source, but other than that, it's not going to happen. So don't do that. And it too is, it's a sphere, and light is traveling around it. It might be hard to see because it's covered up by a few layers of flesh, but it's there and it's happening, and you can pay attention to that. And you can see that if you think of the subtle things of like an eyelid that is sticking out, it's going to cast a shadow. And if we look carefully at our source, we see that it does. That the whites of the eye are darker as they get closer to the eyelashes and the eyelid here. This is going to be a shadow cast. This is a subtle thing, but we understand it in space that way. These are all things that we see intuitively, we know, that are just hard to translate into painting. Two, the eye is, the white is really good at reflecting what's around it. And if we think about our structure again here, light bouncing around in here with other flesh is going to be warmer. And bear that in mind, that there's going to be some warmth in some areas, some cooler areas, simply because it's white, and white is very subject to the color around it, right? It reflects it really well. And in this case, we see so little of the white of the eye, and that's the reason why when we paint it, we've got to stay away from using white. We need to get some planes of skin tones in here. So I'm going to just work on laying those in. So I know there's a lot I'm missing as I go. And I'm just trying to hurry, capture what I see. Learning skin tones and mastering them is just one of the most satisfying things you can do in oil painting, because the subtlety of color is just remarkable, and these little tiny shifts are very satisfying to put in and discover and play with. And so you got a lot of work to do to get there, but I just want to encourage you to keep at it. And to see the fruit at the end of all your labors. One thing you wouldn't expect is there's a lot more green in skin tones than you would think. And there, certainly around the eye, it is so. Again, none of these aren't rules. I say that all the time, but it's true. There are some things, there are some trends you can kind of see, but you may be working on something at some point that's not the case because of the light, the time of day. But there is a cooling effect around the eye. There's some warmer areas, but there are some cooler areas. The warmer areas are oftentimes more around the eyelids, the cooler areas around the socket. And sometimes they're kind of side by side, which is just fascinating. You create a really great energy. One of the reasons why I want to work my way around so that we really see where the eye sits in some of the skin tones around it. It's really valuable to know how it works. And we've got another highlight down through here. An often missed part is this brow ridge doing the eye, and you don't realize that. I think the tendency is to think, oh, the eyebrow rests on that ridge, but if you'll notice, especially here, that ridge comes around the eyebrow, comes up higher, and structurally getting a light area underneath this, where the eyebrow rests, really shows you more the structure of the face, the bone structure underneath. It gives us a nice feeling of 3 dimensions. And it's just more accurate to reality. Things start to get a little warmer in the cheekbones so that, think about when you blush, that's where your color is, on your cheeks. And that's still the case. Things are sort of warmer in this region, and they get cooler around the eye, warmer immediately around the eye. And it's those warm, cool back and forths that will give you a really convincing looking eye. Need to get some darker areas back in here, but they're also very warm. I can pull in some of the black that I had here, but then it's great to keep the eyes really soft. And I think that softness then helps with, there's that desire to like make every eyelash. It's a video for another time, but if you put every eyelash in, you're going into the uncanny valley of realism. So it's not worth the effort. And it feels strange no matter what, no matter how you do it. Now's probably a good time to do a little bit of blending some of these areas. I haven't even put any paint down here. I'm just kind of letting some of this ground layer describe really the same color that's happening around her the lower eyelid. It's kind of happy accident. And when you're doing hair, even in this case, the eyebrow, it's good to keep it loose chunks of color, a little brush strokey, but not exact. Again, we're not trying to tell the story of every single hair. You're a painter, not a camera. And there's a couple of points that you're always going to find reflection. Obviously, they are right above the pupil and on the eyelid, which itself is another surface, kind of like we talked about here. And right here in the tear duct, you usually find a smaller one that's not as evident out here. It's good to include it. And just a little bit of redness that happens at the corners, and these are the trends you can look for. But again, let what you see help you along your way, not the other. Don't use stylistic choices. We can bring out the talked about the concave area here, and that can be, we can add a little bit more to that so that it's a little more green, a little more intense. So really feel the light travel across there. And you'll discover, oh, I didn't quite, perfectly get the pupil in the center, and so sometimes you'll just need to go back in and make little adjustments. Isn't quite round enough. Iris is usually just slightly darker on the rim. And sometimes right where that meets the white of the eye, there's kind of an interesting kind of blue that you can again, this is all about softening. And if it softens these edges, then it's going to be good on the eye. You're always going to want, rather than a hard edge, you just want to keep it soft. So you can use a little bit of kind of blue in there, and then soften it out some. I could make it a little wider down here. Just looking, I can see that I can add some more white. But it still stays about this dark, and perhaps even darker on this far side. So warm or dark, but it's just there. People ask, are eyes hard? And sure, there's a lot going on, yeah. But it's really no harder than anything else when you're painting you're focused on a few shapes, especially the human form is difficult. But it's not too difficult. And again, one eye, way easier than two. Matching two is really where things get difficult. So even if you're intimidated by this, you should try making an eye. I bet you are way better at it than you think. Sometimes little strokes go a long way. And if we want to hint at an eyelash, that's okay. We just don't want to take our time to try to do each one of these. It's going to be worthless. We can just describe as something that somebody would expect a painting to achieve when it comes to realism. That gives it more life, but we're not describing every little thing and then getting lost in minute details that really don't matter. Give myself a little bit more of a highlight here on the eyelid, because we're really thinking about this as a volume. one of the values of working from life is you're going to be able to see the eyelid in a way it's hard to make out when you're working from a photograph. You're going to be able to move a little bit to see it at angles that are helpful. I'm going to add some hints of bottom eyelashes, just a little bit. All right, we're getting near done here. I'm just gonna do a few little touches here and there and soften a few edges. And then I think we can be just about done here. The fun thing about when light hits dark areas, especially these areas like here, like around the eyeliner, it creates these intense blues that are really fun to put in, and our eye immediately sees that as working. It's kind of fun, so I see that a little bit happening here, and I just want to hint at that. And other than just a few little drawing things, there's not much more I would do to the eye. Might just drag this shadow down a little bit. Yeah, there's a few things I could adjust drawing-wise, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. And it's basically pretty simple. Think about this the whole time while you're doing it. Think about the sphere, the bulk of the brow above, and pay attention to each of these little ridges in here, making sure you're telling the viewer about it very carefully, because you're going to see how on the cast, why it's valuable to have one, is this just limits us to seeing the form. And then we really have to place ourselves in making the form when we're making a painting. So really think about that next time you're working on an eye, and then if that's the case, you're going to be able to do it from any angle you like, in any light situation you like, for any skin tone you'd like. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope this was valuable. Hello, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful toward your goals of becoming the artist you're meant to be. Here's some other videos you might like, and click over here to subscribe. If you want to see the channel flourish and ensure continued content, share this with a friend or join my Patreon, link below. And remember, never stop painting.